All right, we are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm just going to do a quick sound check. Jeff, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you are loud and clear.
Wonderful. All right. Let's see if I can progress my screens here. Sorry about that. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad that you are able to join us here today. My name is Erin Gregwire, and I am one of the program managers here at Dynamic Communities and work specifically with the Power Platform side of the business here and providing content for all of you. We're excited, of course, to have everyone on the call today, and I'm just going to quickly go over just a few things related to dynamic communities regarding our user groups, and then as well as give some kind of updates regarding our company's events before I turn it over to Jeff for the webinar. Hopefully you've all joined a local user group, whether that be Power Platform or any other product group of your interest, but I'm going to talk briefly just about Power Platform. So if you haven't joined the Power Platform user group community, we definitely recommend you going out to powerplatformug.com, and you can find a local user group in your area and join one for free. There's a ton of great things going on in the community for you to be involved with, like this webinar today. So especially, during these times of everything, most everything is going virtual. It's just a great way for you to still be connected, to learn and to network with your peers. So please join a local user group today. If you don't see one in your area, reach out to anyone at Dynamic Communities and we would be happy to get one started for you. While you're out on our user group sites, we offer not only the webinars like this one today, but we offer, Academy classes and the Power BI and Power Apps and Automate Black Belt training series, which are structured 4-course series for Microsoft Power users and super users. These trainings will offer you the ability to learn at your desk, at your own convenience, and at your own pace. All of these opportunities, including the list of our upcoming webinars and Academy classes, are located on our user group sites under the Participate drop-down tab. I just wanted to briefly, kind of touch on a few upcoming events that are on the calendar. And, with the current pandemic and what's happening in our world today, our 3 larger community summit events, which are shown here, are designed for all users of the Microsoft Business Applications Platform, which includes not only Power Platform, but also the Dynamics products. This year, our Community Summit Europe event, which was supposed to be in March in Barcelona, is now a virtual experience next week, actually, as well as our Australia event in August will be a virtual event. Our Summit North America is set to be in Nashville in October. And again, of course, we're monitoring that event very closely and hope to have more updates on that, whether it's going to be kind of a hybrid event or, we turn that event to be virtual. But definitely, if there's any updates regarding any of our events, just visit our company website for any of those updates. We not only offer, these large summit events that are happening, but we have and are coming up with, new virtual experience in the meantime with different focus events, as well as our Academy team, has some events that they're putting on, and of course, getting great webinars like this one so that you can attend those while working from home. Before I turn it over to Jeff to kick off the webinar, just a few housekeeping items. We have it set that everyone is on mute right now. But if you have a question, definitely feel free to put your question in that Q&A box, and I can relay those questions to Jeff to answer. And we also will be recording this session and posting it to the webinar recordings library across all of our user group sites under that Participate tab and then under Webinar Recordings. And of course, now what you've all been waiting for is today's webinar, getting started with approvals. And our speaker today is Jeff Abels. He is a very active community member. He speaks at a lot of our events, as well as, he has some more webinars coming up in July and August, and an academy course in July. So of course, we're excited to have him presenting the session for you today. And I, covered a lot of information there. So now I want to, stop sharing here, and I will turn it over to you, Jeff, to kick off this webinar. So here we go.
Okay, thanks so much, Erin. Just real quick, number one, a mic check, and number two, a video check. Can you hear me and see my screen okay?
I can. If anybody has issues, please type that in the questions area or the chat area, and we can address those. So thanks, Jeff.
Okay, excellent. All right, thank you everybody for coming. This is seems to be a pretty popular topic, which is great. What we put together here is this idea of getting us started with approvals and doing approval processes in the Power Platform, or Power Automate in particular. And I've actually aligned it with Dynamics 365. Now, what I'm going to talk about for approvals can be done anywhere. You do not need to have Dynamics to make this work. I was just putting together a useful use case where you might connect it with something that you're already doing. But if you don't have Dynamics at all and you're doing approvals for a document in SharePoint, it will work exactly the same. It's just a slightly different way of triggering those things. So let's dive in together and start talking about what we're going to do in this session. So here's our scenario, just to give you a sense of what might we be doing an approval around. So this is a customer care team, and they need to do approvals prior to issuing some types of returns or credit. They have some empowerment to do some things on their own, like if someone requests an RMA, basically a requested return that's still under warranty, no approvals required. The customer care rep has full authority to take care of that. But if it's out of warranty, or they want to provide the customer with a credit of between 10% and 25%, it has to be escalated to their manager for approval. And if they want to do something even bigger than that, more than a 25% credit, it has to be escalated all the way to the chief customer officer for final approval. So why would we want to do an approval like that? Well, some obvious reasons, maybe not, some not so obvious ones. First of all, if we can give our customers faster service by not having to email an approval request or set it aside and ask someone later, or have it be ambiguous while things get moved all around the organization, we're going to have happier customers, we're going to have more loyalty. Also, if we can create higher user productivity by making this simple, consistent, streamlined, and have happier customers, that actually means our customer service reps are also happier. And there's actually statistics around this. The more customer service reps are empowered to do their jobs and delight customers, the more engaged and happy the customer service reps are, the more they can in turn continue to deliver great service to customers. So it's good for the bottom line, good for the customer, good for the employee. And for some of these larger ones, and this particular one came out of a specific client engagement we worked with, we replicated some of it here for this demo. But the idea was to be able to say that there might be some extreme circumstances where we want to go way above and beyond what someone might even reasonably ask for. And the story behind this one was, if you've ever heard of Zappos, I think I've got this right. Forgive me if I'm choosing the wrong company, but I think it's Zappos that they sell shoes, and I think they're very social minded, so they tend to give away shoes every time you buy a pair, so someone in need gets a pair of shoes whenever you buy. And they've run into circumstances where they said, look, sometimes we want to do something great for a customer, but we can't purely empower reps to do that anytime they want, because it just might not be affordable for us. But the one case in point was a woman called one day and said, I need to order about 20 pairs of shoes. And the Zappos rep pulled their record up and said, that's great, Mrs. Customer, but I see you're buying a lot today. You usually buy 1 or 2 pairs at a time. Anything going on that is causing you to need to do this? And she said, well, we just lost our entire house in a house fire, And so, the insurance is covering part of it. We're just doing our best to kind of put our lives back together again. Well, the rep was able to very quickly get approval for that individual to get 50% off of their order, just in recognition of their loyalty in the past and their desire to serve them. And that not only created great PR outside, it created great PR and sense of self inside. So this is just one other example of what kind of approval you might want to do. So there's a lot of others out there. And what I wanted to do today, I'm only going to do it once or twice, but we're probably all webinar meetings to death right now. So I thought, let me try something different. Instead of asking you a poll question, let me just ask you to either type into your chat for everyone to see or raise your hand. I wanted to get 2 or 3 of you to just share, why are you here today? What kind of approvals do you have in your organization you're hoping to use this for? So I'm good at being quiet, so I'm going to be quiet and let at least 3 come in. So if you want to raise your hand, Aaron can unmute you, or if you want to just type it into chat and share it with everybody, that's fine too. Remember to share it with everyone if you put it in chat.
We had one person say management approvals. And
Awesome.
then approving a definition change in our data glossary.
Nice. That's a very unique one. Excellent. Thank you for those. One more before we move on, at least one.
Okay, I think somebody, let's see here. I'm looking for approval from new product release to productions.
Okay.
And then on a vendor.
So new vendor approval.
Yep, we are in the beginning stages of implementing. Somebody wrote, and then information released for conference presentation. Configurable approvals based on position hierarchy.
We're going to talk about that.
And then trying to learn how to leverage flows in D365. Email conversations for miscellaneous approvals, nothing formal. And then it was approving an address change on a vendor.
Nice. That's another great one. A lot of times people are struggling with someone changes something in CRM. Should we really just let it flow into accounting or not? Okay, thank you, everybody. Those are awesome. We opened up the floodgates. And remember, the session's recorded. So these are all great ones to go back and capture if you didn't, if you want to listen to the recording. But thank you all so much for that. I'll do that once more, time permitting, when we get towards the end of the session today as well. So Aaron did a great job of introducing me. I don't know that I need to spend much time on this, but just to get to know me a tad bit better, if I've not talked to you ever before in one of these, my name is Jeff Abels. I run a company called C5 Insight, and what we do is customer employee engagement projects, particularly around the Microsoft world. So we help with a lot of Microsoft 365, we help with a lot of Dynamics 365 implementations, but also just the process design and consulting around those. In fact, I'm doing a session this Thursday called How to Use CRM to Run Your Sales Meetings. So we do a lot more than just the technical end of these things. So that's kind of the geeky, businessy side of me. I kind of enjoy that kind of stuff. I've written some books and do a lot of speaking on it. And then maybe the slightly less geeky, but the reason why we all do this, here's a little bit more about me. My wife and I are recent empty nesters. I keep saying recent, but it's been probably 3 or 4 years now, so maybe it's not recent anymore. It's an awesome phase. We love traveling together. We love drinking good wine together. We love riding my Harley Davidson motorcycle together. So if any of you can identify with any of that, I'd love to connect with you, maybe hook up and go for a ride sometime. Our 2 grown daughters are now married, and the most exciting new thing in our lives is this little grandson, Theodore Evergreen Tremolini. So lots of exciting stuff going on in our life, and that's our pup. Now that we have an empty nest, she occupies her empty nest with us and brings a little warmth in these COVID days we're all dealing with. So enough about me. Let's jump into this in a little more detail. So let's talk a little bit about this. This actually brings up a few of the points that you guys raised, and then we're going to go in and look hands-on at building our first approval. So a little bit about Power Automate approvals. First of all, they're kind of, to me, they're almost the core Power Automate process. They're a great place to start with Power Automate if you've never done anything with Power Automate before, or if you've done some stuff with Power Automate and you haven't messed around with approvals yet, it's an easy thing to kind of add to your library. But if you've ever worked with any kind of process, if you've developed a workflow in Dynamics before, or a SharePoint workflow, or an Excel macro or anything like that, these are a really easy place to start and learn, and are a simple way to add a lot of value to your organization. Also, if you do have any kind of approval processes in your organization and you have Microsoft 365 with Power Automate, this should be your approval system of record. So hopefully any approvals you already have, more and more of them will move over to this. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. Again, they're simple, they're an easy place to start. You can do your first one in less than 30 minutes, and that's only because you're learning. When you see the first one I build, I'm gonna slow down and go slow through it, but you can actually put a very simple approval together in about 5 minutes. Now, more complex ones take a little longer, but once you've done 2 or 3 of them, they still don't take very long for you to do. And these can be embedded into much more complex flows. So if you're using Power Automate for other things, these can be part and parcel of much larger, more sophisticated work processes that you're automating. So let's jump in. We're going to do our first Power Automate approval. We're going to do it for Dynamics 365. Again, keep in mind that my goal here for this first one was to give you a way to create an approval with as little work as possible. I wouldn't say I'm following best practices strictly here, because I wanted you to get up and running immediately. And even without best practices, a lot of what I do is still within the realm of acceptability, depending on how big your enterprise is and how much governance you should have around these things. Once you see how to do this, you can do this one probably in 5 minutes or less yourself. But I'm going to keep it slow. I'm going to explain a lot. I'm going to take about 20 minutes to go through this. I have pre-recorded it. So what I'm going to do during the recording is I'm going to kind of quietly monitor chat. And if you do have questions, feel free to ask those. It is playing as a video, so hopefully the video and audio will sync well for you as it goes through this. We will be publishing this as a recorded webinar as well, so if you need to go back and look at it, you can. Okay, so let's get busy creating a first, very simple but useful Dynamics 365 approval. You can see I've got several tabs open here, so if you're following along, go ahead and open those up. I have a tab in Dynamics 365. I'm looking at a case. That's the record we're going to build this off of. I have Outlook open. We'll see how these approvals come through in Outlook. And then I have Power Automate open as well. So navigate to all of those things, get those open. And now we're just going to go ahead and create our new flow. So in this case, I'm going to do new. And I'm going to do an instant from blank. This may not be the way you ultimately do it, but I want to start really simple to start with. And you might find this is all that you need in your environment. So do instant from blank. We're going to give this flow a name. So I'm going to call this basic D365 approval. And then I need to choose what triggers this. And I have triggers available based on this being an instant flow. So I want to say when a record is selected in the common data service. So what that means is a user can select a record and run the flow manually. If you ever work with little manual workflows, you kind of know what this looks like. So I'm going to click that and I'm going to say create. Okay. The next thing I get is a quick question on, well, what environment do I want to use? Now I logged into a certain environment, but I can actually change the environment here if I want to. So in this case, I'm just going to choose what it gives me, which is the default environment that's made available to me. And then I'm going to choose an entity name that I want to run this on. And as you may guess, based on how we started this, you probably want to use the case entity to do this. So scroll, find the case entity. Cases, there we go. And once I fill that in, it then says, okay, do you have any other inputs you want to get from the user? I think this is a really cool part of an instant workflow. So I can go, you know, as a matter of fact, I do. I want the user to tell me what kind of approval this is. So I'm going to name this field approval type. And then over here, I'm going to say, let's make this a drop-down list. And let's put some options in here for a user. So it might be an out of warranty RMA. It might be a credit of more than 10%, or it might be a credit of more than 25%. Okay, so just like that, we've kind of decided we've got some input from the user, and now we're going to move into taking that input to create the approval. So the next step that we have in this case is an approval. So to get the list shortened, I'll just start typing approval. And here's sort of the icon for approvals. If I click it, I'll see all the approval types available to me. So there's 3 types available. Today, we're mostly going to be working with the middle one, but just by way of a quick description of each. This middle one we're doing, start and wait for approval, means we will launch the approval process, and the Power Automate, the flow, will stop and wait until it is either accepted or rejected before it follows up with any other following steps. So just sit there idly saying, wait, 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 possibly forever, until the user who is notified to approve it actually submits the approval or rejection. The other 2 go together if you use them. So this first one is, I'm going to create an approval, but I'm going to move immediately from that approval into executing some follow-up steps. And later in the flow, I will wait for that approval to come in before I continue to do some things. So for simple flows, you're almost always going to use start and wait for approval. One might use the others if you have parallel, if you have multiple people who must approve and you want them all to have access to approve something at the same time. You might use the create approval, wait for approval. And there are some other circumstances under which you might use that as well. So let's go ahead and get started with this. So now we have a decision of what kind of approval do you want. So I'll pull this down. I have 4 to choose from. There's 2 kind of categories. The first one is approve or reject. The second is custom responses. So approve or reject is just what you imagine it would be. The recipient of the approval has 2 options to choose from. They can approve this or they can reject it. And then the custom responses, you can actually create other responses in there. So it could be approved, but please modify or reject. So maybe you have a massive proposal making its way through your organization, and you don't want to reject it because of 2 words that need to be tweaked a little bit or something like that. You want that adjustment to be made, but it doesn't need to come back to you. One example of how you might use that. So we're going to use approve, reject. Now we're going to choose, should it be everyone must approve or the first to respond will approve? So what this means is I'm going to give it a list of addresses. Could be 1 address, could be as many email addresses as I want. And if I put a bunch in there, everyone must approve is just what you would imagine. If I put 3 in there, all 3 have to approve it before it actually goes back to the original person saying this is approved. First to respond means it'll go to as many people as you want, but as soon as 1 person responds, it's approved or rejected and it's all over. So for simplicity's sake, we're going to go with first to respond. Now that I'm getting at that, it's going to ask me for some more information. So let's get. Sorry, folks, have to restart it here. Specific detail in here, so when the person gets it, they'll know what is this thing I'm approving without having to click around to get more information. So we're going to name this RMA for credit approval. I could put variables in the title if I want to, coming from this dynamic content. Who am I going to assign this to? So your CRM may autofill this like mine did, so I'm going to assign it to Allie Jamison. Now I'm logged in as Allie Jamison, so I'm submitting and approving. Not an ideal situation, but it helps give you an example of what you're looking for. You can put other addresses in there if you want to. What are the details in here? You can see it says markdown supported, see this address. What that means is using sort of a markdown syntax, I can actually format this nicely. You can go to that URL furnished in here if you want to see more on that. I don't really need to look at all that right now. All I want to do is provide a little more information about where did this come from, what type of approval is it that I'm actually going through. So one thing I want to do is I want to put the name of the person who submitted it in here. So here's the display name of the user who triggered the flow. Yep, I'm going to put that in there. And I'll say, this person has submitted a request to approve a, and then I want to look at the approval type. Remember, that's that field that I gather after I triggered this. There it is, approval type. Put that in there. And then I'll just say, please accept or decline or reject. Okay, so some basic instructions in there. Now, what would also be really helpful is what if I want to look at that case in CRM to see more about who's the customer, what's our history with them, how will we work with them. So this is where that copy paste that I talked about earlier is going to come in handy. Let's go back over here to the case. Let's grab everything up to and including ID equals. Let's copy that. Now let's go back into our flow. Let's paste it in here. Now what we have in here is a link to the item with everything except the unique ID of the item. We want to have that in here as well. So let's go over here and type case, and you can see here's the unique identifier of the case. Great. Drop that in there for me as well. Now in the approval email, that person's going to have a link directly to the case. And to make this friendly, I'd like to have an item link description here as well. So let's go grab the case title. Great. Now when they approve it, they'll see the title of the case, and underneath that is the complex URL for it. Now I might also put in here, hey, who's the person who actually requested this? So I can go put that in here if I want to. I'm not going to worry about it in this case, just for the case of this example. But other things are interesting are, do I want to enable notifications? Sure, I want people to know that this came in. If they're using their mobile app, I want them to get the push notification so they can approve it on a mobile device. And I want to enable reassignment. So if Allie decides that she doesn't have time to approve it, Allie can choose someone else to go approve it for her. So cool, I'm all done with that step. One more step to do, I'm not quite done yet, because although I've gathered the approval, I have not notified the user whether it's been approved or rejected. So let's add one more step to this to send that person an email with the response in it. So I'm going to use Outlook. There we go. And I'm going to find send email. Send an email. And by the way, one side note, whenever you see the number after something, always choose the one with the highest number. If you see one without a number and one with a number, choose the one with a number. If you see multiple numbers, choose the one with the highest number. Because what that means is it's the latest version available for Microsoft. The old one might be there to support organizations who used it. They didn't want to just delete it, but you want to use the latest one that's available to you. Okay, so now who do I want to send this to? Well, I'm going to use dynamic content to fill that in. And what I want to do is I want to send this back to the person who requested this in the first place. So here's the email of the user who triggered the flow. That's what I'm going to put in there. So let's put that in there. And then let's put a subject in here. And let's make it really easy for the user to kind of see a quick update on what's going on. So coming from my approval step in here, I have an outcome. So that says accept or reject. So let's say outcome, : your request for, and then let's go get that case title. There it is. So now I can see accept or reject your request for this case. So like the subject line, I can see exactly what's happened here. Now let's give them a little more information in here. Your, and then I want to put approval type. Remember, this is what I requested at the beginning. This is the data I got at the beginning. There you go. Your approval type request has been, and then again, I want to say accepted or rejected, or accept or reject. In fact, let's say request status is, that makes more sense, accept or reject. And what we want to put in there is the outcome. Okay, and then a little more information. The following comments were made. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. We're going to insert one more thing down here first. And then also put the user-friendly link in here for this user, right? Hey, I want you to be able to go find that record easily if you want to. So let's say use the link below to navigate to the case and respond to the customer. Okay, now I'm going to insert something here as a shortcut. I'm going to put a link in here, and I'm just going to say link title, and I'm going to say link target, and add that to it. We're going to go back and fill that in a little bit later. So you can see that that's been inserted in there. It's got dummy data in it. We're going to come back and fill that in right now. So to fill this in easily, that little pop-up that I put link title and the link into, that won't let me use these dynamic fields. So I put that in here so it kind of do the setup for me. Now I'm going to do the little bit scary, but the code view. Okay, so all I need to know is coming over here to link title, I want to replace that with a case title. So let's see if I can highlight that. Can't, but we'll still make it work. So now I do case, there's a case title. Put that in there. Great. Let's delete link title now. And now between the quotes over here, this is where I need to put the actual link. Now remember, it doesn't have the link inside the data. It has the ID. So I need to come back here to case again, grab the same information, paste it in here in the quotes. And I don't have the final link. I have all but one thing, the unique ID. Put the unique ID in there too. Now I built out a link for this. Okay, almost done. Last thing I need to do up here is remember I said the following comments were made. Let's switch this off now so I can get a nice formatting option. So I want to insert the comments that were made by the user who submitted the approval or rejection. So coming over here and scroll down, and you can see there is a field down here saying responses, comments added by the approver. Cool, that's what I wanted here. Well, watch closely what happens when I click it. So I click that to insert it, and all of a sudden something changed. Might not have been obvious if you weren't looking closely. The email that I was working on, it's still there, it just collapsed it. So everything I did there is still there, but it added this other wrapper to it called apply to each. And in it, it said, what's the output from previous steps I want to apply to each? Responses. Okay, so what does that mean? So first of all, notice when I expanded the email, it gave me this nice little message over here telling me what it means. In my words, what it means is this. If you remember back here on start and wait for approval, I chose first to respond. And remember, all of my options have things in it that says first to respond or all responses. And it allows me to put any number of people in here to assign it to. So Power Automate has to account for, I might have gotten 1 or 3 or 5 or 30 different approvals or declines based on how I put this together. So if I want to insert information from one of them here, which I did, it says, I need to know which one you're talking about. So what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to put this wrapper in here that says, for each one of the responses I received, do this thing. Now, in the case of what we're doing right now, it's not critical because I only submitted this to one person to be approved. But if it went to 2 or 3 or 4 people, I need to decide how I want to handle each one of those. Now, remember also, because I'm doing this with each of the responses I receive, it might be a lot of email coming into the person who requested. So just be aware. But in this case, it's one person that's getting submitted to, only one person can respond, so I'm only going to get one reply to it. You're done. That's it. You've built out your first approval. So you take a look at it. It looks cool. I'm going to save it. Watch the little save icon up here. Takes a little while. Okay, now I go back here just because I like to go back there after I've created one. So that's it. We've created it. Now let's go see it in action. So I'm going to go back to my case. I'm going to refresh my case just to bring in the latest Power Automate stuff. So I'm on my case now, and I want to submit it for an approval. So what do you think I did? So I'll look for the flow button. Hey, I don't see it up here right now. So I'll come over here to the little drop-down ellipsis. I'll click the flows, and there's the flow that I just created. So I can run the flow from here. Now, the first time that I run this flow, it's going to sign me into everything. I'm not going to see this every time, just the first time. So it might be a little confusing for a user to get through it the first time. It'll be good. This is how it usually presents itself in subsequent runs. So here's the field, if you remember, that I created. What kind of approval do I want? I'm going to be doing a credit of more than 10%. Great. Let's run the flow. It's done. Just like that, it's done. The approval has now been submitted. So what does that look like? If we go over to Outlook and we wait for a moment, we will see that flow pop in. So it has submitted it to me for approval. Here's everything that I put into it. So let's approve this. I'm going to click down on approve, and it says, great, give me a reason. And we will say, good customer Great idea to go the extra mile. And I'll submit it. Okay, and in my email, by the way, once this is done, I'll actually have this record of what I did with it. So it builds this directly in the email. So on my mobile device, or my desktop, it's actually built right in there. I don't have to leave my email experience at all to get to it. Now, if I go back over here, I'm adding and I'm now receiving this particular notification. Hey, you've gotten approved. Here it is. For some reason, I butchered the link a little bit here, but that's something I can go back and fix later if I need to. That's it. You created your first functioning approval. Okay. So I apologize. I was going to answer questions as they came in. I saw one come in, and I realized when I started to do that, it paused my video, so I had to hold off. But someone asked, hey, I've done one of these before out of SharePoint. I did the create and not the create and wait, and yet it seemed to process normally. Why is that? Is that what it's supposed to do? So when you do create, it really does just about everything I just demoed to you. So it's still going to create the approval. It's still going to send the alert to the person who's supposed to do the approval. It's still going to process however they handle that approval. It's just not going to wait for them to approve it before it runs other steps in the workflow. Now, this person also said it then updated SharePoint also with the approval status. So I'm not quite sure what was meant by that. And if it did go and do some subsequent steps that depended on the approval without the approval, that might mean that it just went directly to that next step with no if then to govern it. So it just assumed the approval was in place and updated data. So remember, if you create an approval, if you just do a create instead of a create and wait, what's going to happen is it will send the approval and then it will move directly to the next step of the Power Automate, of the flow, without waiting to see if it got approved or not. Now, if that's an if then, it might then get stuck there because it doesn't have an approve or reject. So you might have something funny going on. But if you built it the way I did with no if then, what that would have done is it would have gone directly down to the email and it would have said, here's the result of your approval. Now, that person may have then later still approved it or rejected it, but the email is already run at that point. So at that point, it's effectively done. So hope that answers that question. We can circle back to it at the end if it doesn't. All right, so that was about 20 minutes to do a very simple approval that did not meet all the specifications we outlined at the beginning. We're going to come back to that. So some questions for you to think about. How could you have delivered a better experience by triggering the flow? So in the interest of time, I'm just going to go straight through and kind of give you some other thoughts here. There's a lot of ways you could do it, but one way you could do it is what I'm about to demo in the next flow, and that is I set up 3 additional fields directly on the case entity, and those fields are used to trigger the flow. So now instead of training users to say, if you want to get approval, you have to go up to the ribbon and you have to click flow and you have to execute the right flow and then fill in the information. Instead, build something directly into the form. I'm using a CRM form, but again, it could be SharePoint or it could be Excel for that matter. And I'm saying, okay, if I need an approval, just pick the right value for approval type, put some comments in here. So that's a better experience. So as a manager, if I look at this and say, well, Allie is sending me this to approve, is she just really nice and she always wants to approve doing more? Or can she give me some comments about this that lets me know something like, I talked to this gal and man, she's really going through a hard time. She's a loyal customer, and I think it would be really great to show her some extra loyalty right now to help her replenish her shoe supply. Great. That's something that a manager can use in context to know whether they want to approve or not. And then I put, in this case, a checkbox for triggering this. So check the box, and when you save the record, it'll be submitted for approval automatically. So there's a lot of ways you can do that. I chose a checkbox in this case. So I'm triggering instead of a run that the user has to manually go find and run. It's really triggered based on an action within the user interface. Now, there's other things you can do, especially if you combine this with Power Apps. You can put buttons out there. You can put a custom button directly on that menu in Dynamics if you're using that menu. Lots of different ways you can use to trigger this workflow. So that's one part of the user experience. Remember, the user is both the submitter and the approver. Other ways we can improve this, and I'll walk us through how we did it, how we do these things in a shorter video in just a second here. But Remember, our use case was we want multi-tier approval process, right? So depending on the situation, we might need to have 1 or 2 people approve this. It might be the manager alone, or it might be the manager and the chief customer officer. It would also be nice to have a more friendly email that I get back with the approve or rejection, right? Right now, in that very simple one, all I did is said, what's the approval status? And I put that in the email. So I get a subject line that says something like approve, this case was approved, or reject, this case was rejected. It might be nice to use better language than reject. It might be nice to put something else in there with further instructions, such as, hey, although it was declined this time, feel free to go back and submit something else if you think there's some other approach that might work for this customer. So those things can help, but you need to do it a little differently if you want to do that. And the last thing is, I'd like to make it portable, because most of you probably are working in cases where you might have a development environment where you're testing this and trying it out and developing it, and then you might have a different production environment. That's certainly true of the common data service, anything having to do with Dynamics or the related products. So you want to make it portable, so when you're done developing it, you can move it into a production environment easily without having to go back and edit certain pieces of it. So there's 3 things I can do to better align it with our initial use case and make it a friendlier experience both for the approval and the approvee. So let's take a look at how we're going to do that inside of Dynamics now that we've got it set up. My goal here is to just show you best practices. I'm not going to go through it top to bottom like I did last time, because you now know the basics. I just want to walk you through how it's built. Now let's walk through a flow that meets those other requirements in more detail. So first of all, you might notice I'm in a different place. I'm inside of Power Apps. So we built this one as a solution in Power Apps. Why would we do that? Well, first of all, it is best practice. Anything that's going to impact Dynamics 365 should really be encapsulated inside of a solution. It's easier to maintain, it's easier to find things, it's easier to understand what's going on in your environment. Also, very important is for portability, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But let's start by opening the solution. So here's our solution. I call it the case approval solution. I'm going to open it up. There's not a lot going on inside of the solution. It's really just the case entity. I created my custom fields we talked about a minute ago in there. And then there is my flow, which I just kept with the default name, but you could name this something different if you wanted to. So let's open up that Power App flow and take a look at it. And I'm going to go to Edit. So this looks deceptively simple. As we walk through it, it's probably going to start to feel uncomfortably complex if you've never done one of these before. But really, at its root, it's a pretty simple process that we've just repeated a few times over. You'll see what I mean in a second. So let's go through this bit by bit here. First of all, remember last time we said we want to trigger this based on the user selecting a record. This time we changed it to say when a record is updated, we're going to trigger the flow. So a few things to point out about this. When a record is updated, you probably know what that means. Anything changes on a specific record type, it's going to trigger this flow. Now, the first thing in here is an environment. You might see this looks a little different now. I could have selected one of the 2 actual environments, or I could have set this to current. Setting it to current means that whatever environment this is running in, whatever environment the solution has been installed on, that's the environment it's going to run in. If I chose one of those other environments, then it would still run in that old environment, even if you had moved the solution over. So if you have a development environment, for example, and you want to develop something like this in development, that's a best practice, you should do that. And then maybe move it to test it, another best practice, and finally move it into production when you're ready to put it into production, another best practice. It's going to save you a lot of time if you use that environment current as you go through that process. Now, if you do not put a flow into a solution, you do not have the option to select the current environment. So that portability is going to be lost. Can you still move it? Yeah, but you'll need to go and change this each time you move it if you're going to do that. So that will practice, put it inside the solution, then you can migrate the solution and it will automatically update to the current environment. Now, we want to use cases, so whenever a case is updated, that's when this is going to get triggered. This is the standard scope. If you've ever done workflows and dynamics, you know what that is. If you don't, not the subject of today's discussion, you can take a little more look into researching those. Now, one other thing under advanced items here, attribute filters item. What that means is this will only trigger if this specific attribute changes. So cases might be getting changed all the time, right? As you work through a case, you might constantly be adding notes to it, adding more details to it, attaching other things to it, and this flow would get triggered every time unless you did this. You select that particular field and say only that one. So submit for approval, remember, is a checkbox field I added to the form. So that kind of takes care of this is the situation in which this flow will actually be executed. Now, the first thing we do after that is we look at a condition. So this condition goes one more step to define when the flow runs, because the flow is triggered whenever that submit for approval field gets checked, but it also gets triggered when it gets unchecked. So whenever that field changes, it's going to trigger this. Well, I might want to, for instance, have this workflow when it's all done, automatically uncheck the field. What's that going to do? It's going to re-trigger the workflow. Well, I don't want it to go through the whole flow based on that getting unchecked. So this way I verify that that field is checked, it's equal to yes. If that's true, it proceeds down the yes path here. But if it's not true, it proceeds down the no path. And under the no path, there's nothing to do. So the flow just terminates normally and says, I don't need to run. Now, on the yes path, the first thing we're going to do is going to look kind of familiar to you, right? We're going to say, oh, we have an approval here. This is an approval for the customer service manager. So not a lot of magic in here. You've already gone through this in the last little walkthrough we did. I'm pretty much doing exactly the same thing here that I did before. In this case, I have a particular person's name. That's our customer service manager who has to approve that, and it goes through the process. Now, what's different in this case is I said, hey, I want to have a more personalized message to the user. So instead of just sending an email and saying, here's the outcome, and pasting that as a field, I want to send one of two different emails. One is, this got approved. The other is, this was declined. And that way I can have cleaner language in the emails, a better user experience when I'm doing it. So I do the approval. After the approval, I have another condition. Is the outcome equal to approved? So this person has finished their approval. Now we have the result. If it's equal to approve, I'm going to go down the yes track. If it's equal to decline, or it's not equal to approve, I'm going to go down with the no track. Let's look at the no track real quick. You remember how apply to each works. So for each response, and in this case, I only sent it to one person, so I should only have one response. It should only happen once. I'm going to send this email. And I didn't do a lot of work in formatting this email, but you can see this is my decline email, and I was nicer than just saying, here's the outcome, which is reject. It doesn't feel nice to get an email that says reject, so I could put specific language in here saying, hey, your request has been declined for this. Here's the reason it was declined. I could have said, here's who declined it, all that in here if I wanted to. So now I've gone down the no path. But remember, my whole business case is there might be circumstances where certain types of requests need to be escalated and get another layer of approval. So if I say, yes, my customer service manager approved it, and go down my yes path, I'm kind of repeating this process again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially say, okay, let's look at this condition now and say, was this a request to approve something of 25% or more? So the user picked that from the drop-down list. If not, I'm going to go ahead and send the yes approved email. Now that might sound counterintuitive, but remember up here, the customer service manager approved it. And now we're saying, oh, and it's not something that the chief customer officer needs to approve. So I'm going to go ahead and send the approval email. So I got a yes to this and a no to this condition, so I go down this path. Over here, I got a yes to this condition. So I said, oh, it is something that now needs to be further escalated. The chief customer officer also has to approve it because it's a credit of more than 25%. Again, very little magic in here. You've done everything we just talked about before. I've got a different person's name in here because this is my chief customer officer, and I might have done some other personalization inside the email. One small thing is the item link and the item link description. Remember, I had to kind of create that manually when I first created this? Well, it saved it up here, and I can reuse it without having to rebuild it here. So it saves me a couple of clicks. Again, not much magic there. Now I go down to condition 4. So based on, did the chief customer officer approve this, or did he or she not approve it? And again, on something that looks very similar. And if yes condition, then I'm going to send the final response. This has been approved. If no condition, I'm going to send another final response. This is not approved. Okay, one little shortcut thing you can do here as you build all this out, because you start to see there's a lot of similar things here. There's a lot of this email that looks really similar from one to the other. I'm just changing maybe a couple of words of it. So one thing you can do that's kind of cool is you can come over here and you can say copy this to the clipboard. And then if I were to come over here to add an action, like another email, I can just go to my clipboard and I can actually choose that thing I copied to the clipboard to paste it in here. So as you get into doing these redundant flows that have a lot of similar components to them, I can reuse the components using the clipboard piece if I want to. So that's it. This looks a little bit complex, but it's really just a simple approval, condition, approval, condition to go through this whole process and put all this together into something much more meaningful. And I could have done some stuff here at the end of it too. I mentioned earlier that maybe at the end of every single one of these, I want to have one more step that says, now go reset that checkbox being unchecked again, because I want to give my user the ability to maybe submit an approval request for something a little less significant that might be more likely to go through. So I can add some of that logic to this as well. But that's it. We've now built a multifaceted approval with a very user-friendly experience without the user having to click around a lot and with nice messages going back via email to everybody. All right. So some wrap-up things and answering a few questions that you guys asked at the beginning, or some approval types you're looking for that these did not directly address. And then time permitting, I'll open it up for some questions. So what if you want a record of the approval, right? Something long-term, maybe something you can build into a dashboard. Well, you could, Power Automate tracks approval history. I'll give you another slide on that somewhere. But you can also post the approve and decline to a separate SharePoint list, to a separate CRM entity. You could post it as a post inside of CRM, so people could go back and see directly looking at the CRM record, here's when it got approved, all of those kinds of things. If you build a database of those things somewhere, SharePoint or CRM or some other application, you could then use that to actually drive dashboards, to even do things like say, here's how fast we're doing approvals and those kinds of things as other KPIs and metrics you want to track. What about if a manager leaves or is unavailable frequently? We've put specific names in here. So what happens with that if we're trying to keep up with them? Well, you could rewrite all the flows if the manager leaves, or you could do something like use a distribution list. So you can use an Outlook distribution list in here. You can use a CRM team. So if you're familiar with creating teams in CRM, you can even post to a Microsoft team. So you can say, well, anybody who's on this team of HR advocates or whatever it is, they have the ability to approve this. They just monitor that channel of that team, and they can go click the link to do the approval if they need to. Someone did specifically ask this, well, what if the approver actually depends on the submitter? So a simple use case for this is something like, I am an employee and I have a manager. Maybe I'm a sales employee and I have a regional manager, and it's really my regional manager who has to approve. Well, that's a different person for me than it is for someone else who's doing the approval. Well, there's a couple of places you can do something with that. One is directly inside of Power Automate. There is the ability to look at the Office 365, Microsoft 365 users, and fetch the manager of the current user from there. And if it needs to be the manager's manager, you can then fetch the manager of that. So look up something like user when you're adding actions to your flow, and you'll see those options in there in that list of actions. Now, if you don't have a well-maintained Active Directory is where that stuff really lives, but you've maintained it well in Dynamics, and this is a Dynamics flow. Well, Dynamics also has a manager link inside the user entity. You could even do something like create your own links. So you could say, in user records in CRM, maybe it's not the manager. Maybe there's someone else somewhere else that approves things for different users under different circumstances. Well, under the user entity, you can track that information. You can fetch it from there, and you can direct the emails and the approvals accordingly. What if we want to resubmit, or what if we want to prevent resubmitting? So that's going to probably be a little more application dependent. I use Dynamics in my example, so you might use something like a business rule or some JavaScript to say, hey, after that box is checked the first time, I'm not going to make it visible in the field anymore. I don't want the user to be able to resubmit that. It's going to be hidden from then on. Or you could even hide an entire section of something. And app by app, that can vary. So Power Apps in general, you can do the same kinds of things. And of course, in SharePoint, if you want to, you can use the input form, and you can use Power Apps to update that input form very simply. Doesn't require a lot of expertise, but to do a few little tweaks to that SharePoint data entry form to make that a little more manageable for you. And then when we talked about resetting the submit, what if I said I want it to be really easy for my user to resubmit if they want to in the future? Well, again, our CRM example, directly inside of Power Automate, I could have had an action at the end that says, hey, go uncheck that checkbox so that the user can just check it again if they want to resubmit something. If I want to get really sophisticated, maybe I can even use a business rule or some JavaScript to remove the higher end options that were declined already to limit what they can submit in the future. But that, again, is going to be managed more by your source application. Now, if you're struggling with that and say, well, how do I even know? Part of what you might have to do is track another field saying, has this been submitted before or has it not? And it might be a hidden field, but you just use it to change how the form is rendered. That's getting a little more sophisticated, but some other ideas. Okay, some closing thoughts as we start to get into wrapping up here. First of all, as you think about these, you can kind of see they're pretty simple to get started with, but you probably should make some what I would call enterprise decisions as you get into this. What I mean by that is, are you going to have an approval system of record? Because a lot of other systems also have the ability to do approvals. But if you are using Salesforce.com's approval engine for some approvals that are related to CRM, but you're using Microsoft 365's approval engine for approvals that are related to things that are not CRM, well, now you've got two different places you're going to maintain approvals, two different experiences that users may have, two different types of technology to maintain. Because Microsoft 365 integrates with most tools, including Salesforce, you could say, well, we're not going to use Salesforce's approval engine. We'll use the one inside of Microsoft to have consistency around that. Do you want to track all your approvals in a database? So, for example, do you want to have metrics you can pull to say, how many approvals are people having to do? How often are they approving? How fast do they approve? Are high priority approvals being tracked quickly? If you want all that kind of reports or information, or even just a legacy view saying, well, somebody said this was approved a year ago, but do we have a record that actually says, that confirms that it was approved? If you want to answer those questions, you're going to want to maintain that list of approvals somewhere. So decide, yes, we're going to need to do that for everything, or no, we're going to allow people to do that on a project by project basis. And then also, kind of in alignment with that first bullet, will you even have an approval tracking system of record? The first few you're doing probably seems like this doesn't matter, it's insignificant, but you wake up 2 years from now and all of a sudden you've got a big mess with lots of systems doing approvals and you're trying to get your hands around it. You will wish you had answered that question earlier on in the process. So it's something to think about up front during the design stage. Now, on a project by project basis, some other decisions. How are you going to trigger the approval? What type of approval is this going to be? That's going to drive how you build out all the ifs, thens, and splits and that kind of stuff. How are you going to identify your approvers? Is it by name? Is it relative to the user? Is it something else? Is it by team? How are we going to make it fast and easy? Remember, it's easy to create an approval overall, a little more sophisticated to create one that creates a great experience for everybody involved. And where's it going to be visible? Are you going to track it long-term or not? Back to those enterprise questions, but how do they apply to projects? Some other last closing thoughts. Just remember, you can QA your Power Automates very easily. So there's some easy steps to do that. I didn't have time to get into it today. What I suggest is always build your approvals step by step. I navigated you through that big hierarchical one at the end that seemed a little bit confusing. Never build that entire type of approval all at once. You probably will anyway, because you'll kind of wade into it before you know it, you'll have built one. You'll never do it again when you build one out and you go to save it and it says something's wrong, I can't save it, and you didn't do QA step by step, and you've either got to spend a lot of time going through every step you just built to see what's keeping it from saving, or you toss it and start over from scratch. So ideally, one step at a time, do the step, test the step, do another step, test the other step. Long-term thought, by the way, you can get very sophisticated with these. So that same client that I use as an example here, their RMA process, their return authorization process, includes the customer sending in a photo of the item with the serial number on it and the damage done to it. So in the past, they were basically having to go through, and the customer service rep would have to look at each one of those photos to say, is this a product they're making the warranty claim for? Is this even one of our products? Does this look like damage we cover? AI can do some of that for them now. And so what they're able to do is eliminate about 60% of what they used to approve by hand, which could take a day to wait for photos to come in, then wait for them to have time to actually look at them and make a decision before moving on. Moves things through the process much more quickly. And for the remaining 40%, they process those much more quickly. So I'm not necessarily saying there's a case for that for all of you, but what I am saying is there are a lot of other things you can bring into this process to make it more efficient. That's one small example. A few other closing thoughts. Approvals are stored somewhere. Whenever people approve something, it's stored inside of the common data service and the common data model. In fact, the first time you create an approval flow in Power Automate, if you go and look at the common data model, it's going to add those two additional solutions that you see in the red circle there. So the very first time you build a Power Automate and you start testing it, you might think, why is this taking so long to get the approval request? Well, it's because it's actually modifying the common data model to enable that to happen. If you're using 3 different environments, so 3 different copies of the common data model, it's going to go through that process for each of the 3. And as you submit and approve, it's actually tracking those in the common data model in there. Now, if you go look at that link that I've put on the page here, you'll find that Microsoft says this is a largely undocumented data model. It's something we're using just to maintain this information. So as I scanned through that, I thought, that doesn't sound like something I want to report on. That doesn't sound like something I necessarily even want to count on as having long-term all the information that I want to report on in the future. So you may go back to, do we want to track these in a database? Yes, it's tracking them in a database for you, but there's a lot unknown about that database. If you want historical visibility into your approvals, you really need to build your own database of those approvals for your own reporting purposes. And for those of you who are using the common data model for dynamic CRM types of things, know that project service automation, the Dynamics 365 module, it has a few of its own approval entities built in there that it uses exclusively for itself. So don't get what you're doing confused with those and kind of get all wrapped around yourself putting information in places where you shouldn't put it. Those are really reserved just for that particular module to use. All right, we're a few minutes over time. Apologies for that. I can stick around for a few minutes to take questions, so I will. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about some of these other things that we've alluded to, I got a couple of ebooks for you. If you want some of the links that I referred to earlier, you can hit me up for those too. There's my contact information. Feel free to just reach out. Glad to get you anything you need to be more successful with this. If your question isn't answered today, ping me, I'll help you, or better yet, use the forums in the Power Platform user group. There's a bunch of people, including me, who are always active in there, answering questions for people and submitting questions. Happy to help there as well. And of course, this is the business we're in. So if you're looking for a partner to come alongside and help you with these things, we'd be delighted to have a conversation with you about that as well. Aaron, let me turn it over to you now to see if there are any questions and for closing comments.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yep, I did type a bunch of questions in the chat for you, and I'm not sure. Hopefully, if you want to stay on, definitely. If you want to, let's see. Somebody said, one of the best webinars I've attended. Thank you. Thanks,
Oh,
Anne. That's
awesome. Thank
awesome.
you.
Let's see. I don't know if you want to kind of go through those questions or
I'll read them. I'm sorry, it was all tiny and I didn't see the others coming in. So
nope.
let me just read through them each, and if I can comment on them, I will. And if you want to stick around, awesome. If you don't, I get it. Feel free to jump. So here are some other questions. Can we add it to a queue as well for approval? So sure, because queues are given an email address, you should be able to assign them to a queue as well. You of course have the monitoring issue with that, but you should be able to do that as well. Great point. For the assigned to, could you use the owner of the record and have it send to the owner's email? Yes, absolutely. So anything that's stored in the database, so in this case, this person sounds like they know Dynamics. If you have the owner, for example, of a case, there's a field called owner, that's a link to a name in the user entity of Dynamics, which essentially is a link to a Microsoft 365 Active Directory user. You can go grab that owner, you can put that in the assign to, you can assign to that person to approve if you want to. Or, by the way, you could also navigate to that person's manager using their user record, assuming you populated those fields. Will this address automatically change from environment to environment? So that was probably from the first video, and the answer is if you do not put current in there, that will not migrate from environment to environment. So if you assign a flow to a specific environment and then you try to move it to another environment, it will essentially run against that other environment. You'll need to go change it. But in the second video, you saw how you can use current for the environment. And now if you move that flow via a solution from environment to environment, it will migrate. By the way, one other thing I noticed on that just this morning working on another flow for somebody, I did not create a solution and I saw the current environment was available. So Microsoft is changing things so regularly, they might have changed that, or frankly, I might have had bad information on that, but it does appear that maybe that's starting to be available even without using a dynamic solution. Does the person who approves the case need to have Dynamics 365/Power Automate license? Great question. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that the answer to that is yes. I believe that the entire point of that is to interact with, to run Power Automates and to use and access Power Automate, you have to have that license. Now, I also believe that if you have Microsoft 365 license, you have some level of Power Automate. And if you have Dynamics 365 license, you have some level of Power Automate license already. So although you might look at it and say, oh, well, we've got a Microsoft 365 E3 license, that looks like it's just email and SharePoint, that might include enough Power Automate for you to get that done too. So be aware of your licensing. It's complex, it's funky. I don't know all the rules. I have to research it myself often, but be aware of it so you don't go buy licenses you don't need or set something up that needs a license you don't have. How will it send the request to multiple approvers via Power Automate? Great question. It's a little bit of a detailed answer, but if you remember that approver field that I filled in, I could have just stuck multiple people directly in that field. So I could have said, person 1, person 2, person 3, and it would have sent the approval request to all 3 of them all at the same time. And depending on the type of approval you did, if it's first to approve, as soon as one approves it, it's in. If it's all must approve, it waits till all of them have approved it, and then it continues, or reject, or whatever the answer is. That's one scenario. But in another scenario, you might have parallel approvals where you say, I want 3 people to get this at the same time. They're looking at it for 3 different reasons, and someone might say, hey, I'm going to do a technical approval of this. It passes security hurdles. I'm going to do a user interface approval of this. Is it acceptable from the end user? And you might say, I can have one person approve and another person reject, and so I need to go fix the reject thing and get that person to reapprove it, to be very complicated. So in that case, you can actually have one of those approvals where you say, create the approval, but not the wait, and create another approval without the wait, and then create the wait at the end of each of those to monitor them. So those are parallel approvals where you have multiple running at the same time. A little complex, I know, but it was a question that kind of begged that. Let's see, how do we stop user from processing the case while the approval is in progress? So I'm not quite sure I understand that one, but let me just kind of say what I think the answer is. So remember, you have 3 approval types, and one is create and wait. So, oh, I see. How do we stop the user from progressing the case? I've gotcha. Okay. So in that case, you would probably need to do something like say, I need to update the status of this case and let the calling applications, so in this case Dynamics, put the controls in place to stop the case, right? Power Automate really can't just do something that stops it, but I could put another flag in there saying something like pending approval, or that checkbox that said I've checked the box saying this is submitted for approval. I could then do something like reassign that case to a different user, or set the case to inactive for a little while and not allow the user to change that status, and then automatically reactivate it when it's done. But those are things I have to kind of control more or less from within CRM. I can update fields that drive that process, but the process itself, that's generally controlled by the calling application. For the email assign, could you use the owner of the record and have it send to the owner's email? Yes. Can you monitor the status of the flow to see if it has gotten lost in someone's email inbox? Great question. So I think that's where you would actually, first of all, if you go into the case management area, let me see, I think I've got this open. So let me just go to it in Power Automate here. So in Power Automate, there's an action items area and there's approvals. So remember, this is the data that's actually stored in the common data model, and you can see here they are by status. These are ones that have been received. These are ones that have been sent, and here's our overall history. So you can go in here and you can kind of see, hey, here's ones that have not yet been approved or declined, and you can monitor them there if you want to. As I said, you can also put them in a custom table that keeps track of those. Or if you say, well, you know what, I've got some people who are notorious for just ignoring their inbox, and after a week it gets buried and it's never going to get approved if they don't do it. That's where you can again have a separate create and wait condition. So you can say create it and then check to have a loop that basically says check to see if it has been processed or not yet. If not, after 7 days, send a reminder. Continue the loop until it finally gets approved and you can move on from there. Very good question. Last question. I have a use case for invoice appeals. I want the submitter to type in the invoice ID and then auto-populate a form from SQL Server. The rest would go through the approval flow. Can I integrate the SQL query in Flow? So the answer is yes, because Flow via Power Automate connectors can connect to SQL Server. How difficult or easy is that? Well, if it's a Azure SQL database, it's a little simpler than if it's an on-prem SQL, then you're going to need to have essentially a connector to be able to connect to that to do the updates. But it is possible to do that. It's somewhere between a little bit tricky and really tricky depending on your current environment. And last thing I said, please provide details on enterprise approval by Microsoft. I am not quite sure what that is. Maybe it's someone asking for some of the follow-up info. And if you want that, please just email me and I'll get that to you. I'll put my email address up here again in case you want that from me. Those are all the questions I had. Aaron, have any more come in?
There's just one last question that just came in. We create technical documents, Word, which are reviewed and approved by Architectural Board. It contains a few members. I wonder if we can use Power Automate to manage this approval process.
So without knowing the details behind it, I am highly confident you can use Power Automate to automate that process, including the approvals. How you envision doing it might change a little bit, but put simply, remember that if you're tracking a document and you're saving it in Microsoft 365 anywhere, OneDrive, a SharePoint file, wherever it is, that is in a list, just like a CRM record that I showed you. And you can trigger flows from items and lists, just like you can trigger flows from items inside of CRM. So you should be able to have a document in there, trigger a flow for approval, go through appropriate approval processes. We've actually built pretty sophisticated flows for folks who've even said, we're going to have the document template selected based on user input in SharePoint. So that user input are things like, this is a proposal, it's going to someone in this industry, it's for this type of product, it chooses the right template, it then mail merges all the data into that document from, in our case, it was Dynamic CRM, and then it submits it for approval once the user says it's all done and ready for approval, and it gives them an approval monitoring database, so they can easily go in and say, where are these in the approval process? It also enforces file naming standards via Power Automate, so that users aren't giving them all sorts of wonky names, and file location standards via SharePoint and Power Automate, so everyone knows where to go to find what it is that they're looking for. It's all stored in a standard location.
Wonderful. All right, I don't see any other questions. Thank you, Jeff, for staying on to answer all those questions, and for all those that stayed on to hear those answers. We appreciate you doing this webinar today. It was wonderful. And I just hope that everyone has a wonderful day. We will be posting this out, like I said, to the user group webinar recordings tab. And then, like Jeff said, if you have any further questions, I'm sure he's happy to answer those for you by reaching out to him, or definitely feel free to use the user group exchange sites and type your questions in there. So thank you,
Thank
Jeff.
you,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone,
Thank
for
you.
attending. Hope you all have a
Bye-bye.
wonderful day. Bye-bye.